Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. What's happening, Mark?
Quite a bit was happening for me this week. I celebrated a birthday this week.
Oh.
I took aside some time and just did some things that were fun and had a good time. I was doing most of those activities by myself, so I didn't really have to deal with COVID regulations or worrying about, inviting people into a crowded environment where we might get sick. I was just sort of slipping in to get a breakfast sandwich and then slipping out again.
Yeah.
But it was really nice just to take some time for myself.
Yeah, well, happy solitary birthday.
Thank you. I don't think there's a Hallmark card for that, but thank you.
All right, shall we move on to our topic?
We shall.
So at the end of the last episode, I mentioned that I think today's topic is a little different from the typical mansplaining topic. And I want to say a little bit about that before I tee this up for you. I feel like most of our mansplaining topics ultimately are factual questions, so one of us asks the other, why is the sky blue? Right? And then the other guy goes off and researches that factual matter and comes up with an interesting, hopefully interesting answer. And the interesting part is usually the why part, but there's no question but that the factual underpinning, the sky is blue. So it's up to me to tell you why it's blue. So I feel like today's question differs from that script in that it's really kind of a hypothesis that I have based on some current events. And I'm asking you basically to tell me whether I'm onto something here or not, whether my hypothesis is true or not, in your opinion. So the hypothesis has to do with my ruminations about our now former New York Governor, Andrew Cuomo, who resigned amidst a hail of sexual misconduct accusations. And my thinking about how Cuomo is just the latest in a long line of New York politicians and national politicians, all of them male, to resign under a cloud of some kind of sexual misconduct scandal. And I was thinking about, why does that happen so often? What is it about being a male politician and being involved in this kind of scandal? I got to thinking that there's some connection between those two things. The male politicians are probably more likely to be involved in sexual misconduct scandals. And I think the reason for that is because the desire for power seems to be the common denominator between politics and sexual misconduct. So I think there's a connection there. So I floated this hypothesis to you at the end of the last episode. I said I think it's not a coincidence that so many politicians find themselves in this situation. And I want to know whether you think my hypothesis has merit. So what do you think, Mark?
Well, I think this turned out to be a very interesting question, so thank you for asking it. And for those of our listeners who heard the previous episode, they will recall that I used a very specific term, and I do want to talk about terminology. In your original question, you asked about the link between political ambition and sexual predation. And I did look into the psychology of sexual predators, which is a category primarily focused on behaviors like rape and pedophilia. And reading through the literature on predation is harrowing, but it describes the psychology of very troubled people motivated by feelings of alienation, anger, and often a sense of inferiority, who most commonly operate on the margins of society. So a picture of Andrew Cuomo isn't really emerging there. If, though, you look at a different but related category, sexual harassment, then I think we get into more fruitful territory, so that's where I'm going to be focusing today.
I think the reason I use the word predator in the earlier episode, though I appreciate the correction you're making now, is because after reading the stories of how Governor Cuomo kind of tested and groomed these multiple female underlings for a potential affair, that sure sounded to me like a predator stalking his prey. Mm-hmm. And so I use that word kind of advisedly.
Sure.
But I hear what you're saying.
I don't want to suggest, mind you, that there is some fundamental difference between a sexual harasser and a sexual predator. The two are clearly overlapping categories, but what I've read on the psychology of sexual harassment does appear to offer a better answer to your question. And here's a quick preview. There does appear to be a strong correlation between success in politics and sexual harassment, but the reasons for that might go a little deeper than you were originally thinking. And I believe the first question we have to ask is, why is sexual harassment a thing in the first place? And why is it so pervasive? Nationwide, 81% of women and 43% of men have reported some form of sexual harassment in their lifetime, be it verbal harassment, unwelcome touching, online harassment, being physically followed or menaced, or outright sexual assault. As a result of this harassment, 31% of women and 20% of men surveyed have reported feeling anxious or depressed. It turns out there are a number of theories to account for this behavior. Evolutionary biologists argue that sexual harassment is a function of biology. Men are genetically programmed to seek multiple sexual partners on the grounds that more partners means more children who will be born bearing your genes. By this rationale, sexual harassment is so common because it's a genetically successful strategy. Men with the harasser gene are more likely to get multiple women pregnant, and those babies will share the genetic code that turned their father into a harasser. Meanwhile, nice guys finish last and also are on an evolutionary dead-end path. Their nice guy genes are likely to result in fewer offspring, and after thousands of generations, inevitable extinction for this branch of humanity.
Ugh.
Yeah, I know. Bad news for you and me. But many people have already pointed out how problematic this theory is. It not only offers an explanation for sexual harassment, it associates harassment with evolutionary success in a way that could be read as excusing or even encouraging it. And there are some clear holes in this theory when you hold it up to the real observable world. First, if all men are driven by their Y chromosomes to make sexual advances on as many women as possible, there's one big question to answer. How come not all men are doing that? Many men go about their business without attempting to seduce every woman they meet.
Right. Cuomo, from all I've read and seen over the years, and he's been my governor for nearly 12 years and was a national figure before that, so I've read and seen a lot about him over the years. He just seems like a detestable human being to me. Petty, vindictive, bully, a son of a bitch. To men, especially, like the current mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, Cuomo just cannot let de Blasio ever take credit for anything.
Sure.
It's such petty behavior. And it just seems to me that, boy, if that's an evolutionary strategy, God help us if we're creating men like that, passing along their genes.
Well, stay tuned, because the path we are on within this podcast will take us through very, very many men who are detestable human beings.
Okay. Can't wait.
Yeah. So there are two other theories that try a different approach. They argue that sexual harassment emerges out of power dynamics. According to the first of these theories, sexual harassment is a strategy. It is a form of deliberate abuse that serves to reinforce power structures, and accordingly the victims of harassment are those who threaten heterosexual male dominance and traditional hierarchies. For instance, women in positions of authority, feminists, either male or female, sexual minorities, and women who have taken positions within traditionally masculinized spaces and industries. A different but similar theory points out that victims of sexual harassment are often quite powerless. Migrant women, hotel maids, waitresses, and domestic workers, who in no way can plausibly be said to be challenging male dominance or traditional power structures. The social power theory accordingly argues that harassers believe that their position of authority gives them the right to make demands of others, and so they focus their harassment on people who are institutionally less powerful than they are. These two theories agree that power enables harassment. The latter is a function of the former. As before, though, it raises the question, if powerful men engage in sexual harassment for no reason other than the fact that they're powerful, why is it that not all powerful men are harassers? It would seem at least one additional factor is operating here. And a more nuanced view says that sexual harassment emerges out of the interplay of multiple factors. Some of these are social and organizational. For instance, the institutional power that we've already seen to be correlated with sexual harassment. According to this theory, the reason that not every powerful man is a harasser is because social and organizational factors interact with personal and psychological factors. The environment makes harassment possible, and in some cases even makes it socially acceptable. But sexual harassment doesn't emerge unless the person in power possesses certain personality traits. And in fact, psychologists speak of a, quote, dark triad, unquote, of personality traits that are associated with sexual harassment. Now, I know the dark triad kind of sounds like a league of Batman villains, but they are actually 3 psychological types. Joe, can you name the 3 elements of the dark triad?
I cannot, but let me see if I can take a stab at it, because I think our last president probably has the dark triad, if not the dark pentagram or larger. Narcissism, I think, has to be part of the love of self.
Yes, that's one of the 3, so good start.
And then utter contempt for people, the inability to have compassion for people. I mean, this is another thing I saw in Trump and Cuomo.
Those are 2 subtraits.
So that's what I got.
Okay, at a higher level, the 3 elements of the dark triad are narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism.
Okay, you got to define.
Sure. Narcissism, of course, is something we've all been talking about a lot lately. It was basically the word of the year in 2016. And it is characterized by certain traits, which are specifically egotism and self-obsession, troubled interpersonal relationships, a lack of empathy and tendency to exploit others, and a sense of entitlement and expectation of special favors. The poster child for narcissism is, as you said, Donald Trump, but we probably all have at least one narcissist in our lives. I personally have had 2 or 3. Psychopathy, meanwhile, is characterized by a lack of remorse, low degree of empathy, high degree of competitiveness, a grandiose sense of self, superficial charm, manipulative behavior, refusal to take responsibility for one's actions, and a fearlessness that can result in impulsive behavior that borders on recklessness. We tend to associate psychopathy with criminal behavior, but not all psychopaths are criminals. Many are high-functioning, highly successful members of society. And the 3rd member of the dark triad is Machiavellianism, which is a close cousin to psychopathy. This trait is characterized by selfish, manipulative behavior, a callous indifference to morality, lack of empathy, and low emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
If you watch the first few seasons of Netflix's House of Cards, the character played by Kevin Spacey was a very good example of Machiavellianism.
Yeah, using people as pawns in their own game.
Right, exactly. Some psychologists have argued that Machiavellianism is a subset of psychopathy since the 2 have so much in common. But the current consensus is that the 2 are distinct. And in fact, Machiavellianism lacks the reckless impulsivity that psychopaths are prone to.
And yet, I think there's a lot of overlap between these 3 categories. And it's interesting because I think in my question to you last time, I said something like, I thought there was a Venn diagram of the population of male politicians and male sexual predators that kind of closely overlaps, right? Is almost a circle. So it seems to me like if we had to draw the dark triad, it would be 3 circles that are closely overlapping.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I would imagine you could only be 2 of these at a time because Machiavellianism and psychopathy are so related to each other. But really the way to think about this is that none of these are binary states. They are composed of subcategories, and we all are higher or lower within those categories.
Right.
And so, yes, you can easily score well on more than one of these things.
Right, and if you're far along the spectrum of all 3, then you're got the dark triad.
Yes. Then you're evil Spock in Star Trek.
Yeah.
So that's the dark triad, and it's important to point out that those who have dark triad traits are not a separate species. We all have those traits to some extent. Some people simply display the traits more clearly and perhaps experience related urges more intensely. And 2 of the 3 are inborn. Narcissism and psychopathy have been shown to have a strong genetic component. Machiavellianism, however, appears to be a learned behavior. And I, for one, have a great deal of sympathy for any child raised in an environment that teaches him to follow the teachings of Niccolo Machiavelli.
So, boy, inherited component. So when I tortured those animals as a child, I can say I'm from a family of psychopaths as a defense.
That's right. Yeah, just blame your father.
Okay, good to know.
You might have noticed that the three traits share in common a lack of empathy, but it is a particular kind of empathy that they lack. Researchers suggest that there are two types of empathy, hot and cold. Cold empathy is the ability to understand how people will react to what we do. People with dark triad traits have no problem with that. Their success at manipulating the people around them depends on cold empathy. Hot empathy, though, is the understanding of how people will feel about what we do, and that is completely lacking within the dark triad. It's not even that such people don't care how we feel. To some extent, which probably varies from individual to individual, they're incapable of understanding that we feel anything at all, and so they typically feel no remorse for what they have done to us. Now, there are some advantages to the dark triad personality traits. There are strong correlations between the dark triad and what we would conventionally describe as leadership qualities. Successful political candidates need to be power-seeking, immune to criticism, and unconcerned with how the demands of the campaign affect friends or family, a combination that comes easily to those who possess dark triad traits. Such people tend to be bold, forceful, courageous, and neither sensitive to criticism nor prone to self-doubt. In the workplace, for instance, it's long been noted that narcissists and psychopaths tend to rise quickly through the ranks. In the case of narcissists, that's because they tend to act like leaders long before they possess actual authority. And as I have often been advised by my managers, the best way to get a promotion is to act like you have the job you want before that's actually your job. High-functioning psychopaths, meanwhile, are often both charming and manipulative, two skills that are always helpful if you're trying to climb the corporate ladder. Likewise, politics is a common line of work for people who possess these traits. A study that drew on data from the US and Denmark showed that those who score higher in narcissism participate more in politics. They're more likely to contact politicians, sign petitions, join demonstrations, donate money, and vote in midterm elections. Political participation was, on the other hand, negatively correlated with high self-sufficiency, which suggests that narcissists get involved in politics because they feel their needs are not being met, and they're looking for other people to satisfy them.
It's so funny you mentioned that Star Trek joke a minute ago, because now as you're talking about this section, I'm thinking of that Star Trek episode, The Enemy Within, which was written by the great Richard Matheson, by the way, the one with the episode with the good Kirk and the bad Kirk. There's a transporter malfunction. Kirk gets split into two people. It's kind of a spin on the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The good Kirk has qualities of sensitivity, rationality, but he can't make decisions in command, Yeah. Whereas the bad Kirk is manipulative, impulsive, very decisive, but utterly unqualified to be the commander. Put them together and you've got the perfect commander. So this really lends credence to your argument about how the dark triad informs some leadership decisions and politicians who are actually leaders.
Yeah.
So I find that very interesting. I wonder when the dark triad was coined or discovered, because Matheson wrote this episode in the mid-1960s. So when did this theory take hold?
That I don't know. It did not come out in my reading. But if it came out after Matheson, then we would have to assume that he just had some intuitive understanding of what later came out of psychological research.
Yeah.
So there's research that goes back 25 years that says narcissism is more common among politicians than people in other professions. And there are even signs that grandiose narcissism, a form of the trait that's characterized by immodesty, boastfulness, and interpersonal dominance, has become more common among politicians in recent years. And when we talk about narcissistic politicians, we're not just talking about Donald Trump. So pop quiz, Joe. If we leave Trump out of it, name 4 presidents since 1960 whose scholars have judged to be high on the narcissism scale.
Well, JFK, I think, has got to be one of them.
Ding, 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 correct?
He was another philanderer.
Mm-hmm.
LBJ, I think, was probably had a very high opinion of himself.
You're 2 for 2 so far. Very good.
Let me see if I can nail all of them. Well, Nixon certainly clicks the Machiavellian and psychopathy boxes,
Bingo.
so I'll guess Nixon.
And can you hit for the psycho and name the fourth?
Yeah, let me see. Definitely not Jimmy Carter, definitely not Gerald Ford. Who would the other one be? Oh, Bill Clinton.
Oh.
It's got to be Bill Clinton.
You are killing it. You named all 4. Congratulations.
All right, well, it isn't that hard, but I'll take credit for it.
Okay, so second part of the quiz. Name the 3 presidents since 1960 who historians have judged to be low on the narcissism scale.
Well, Jimmy Carter for sure.
Yes.
And I've got to think Gerald Ford because he's so milquetoast.
You are killing it, Joe. You're 6 for 6 so far. Can you bring it home with the perfect record? One more.
George H.W. Bush?
This is your day, Joe. You have a gift. You have a gift for judging the relative narcissism of
Well, I think
major
about
politicians.
male politicians a lot as the reason why I asked you that question. So it shouldn't be that surprising.
Okay. So those latter 3 names, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, and George Herbert Walker Bush, they probably rank pretty high on most people's likability scale.
Yep.
They seem like decent people.
Yep.
But no one is going to be putting them on a list of history's greatest presidents or carving their likeness into Mount Rushmore.
Correct. Yes.
Meanwhile, Lyndon Johnson might have been our most recent dark triad president. In addition to scoring high for narcissism, he's also pretty up there on the psychopathy scale because of his apparent fearlessness, his lack of shame or remorse, tendency to abuse his wife and underlings, and willingness to do almost anything to get what he wanted. There's a famous photo of Johnson that has always haunted me. It shows him holding up his pet beagle by the ears, and that image makes a whole lot more sense if you think that Johnson was a bit of a psychopath.
Mm.
And he got things done. When I was in high school, I read a book that argued that Johnson was one of our greatest presidents.
It's like Bad Kirk personified, right?
Yeah.
I got to go back and watch that Star Trek episode. It's increasingly relevant as you keep talking.
I know. In the 19th century, the psychology pioneer William James wrote, quote, "When superior intellect and a psychopathic temperament coalesce in the same individual, we have the best possible conditions for the kind of effective genius that gets into the biological dictionaries," unquote. In short, you need a bit of the dark triad to be great, or I should say, to be judged great by historians, which isn't exactly the same thing.
Important distinction, yes.
When it comes to sexual behavior, meanwhile, those who exhibit dark triad personality traits report more sex partners than average, more favorable attitudes towards casual sex, limited self-control and a greater interest in short-term gratification, and a greater tendency to think of sex and romance as a kind of game that you play to win.
Yeah.
If you enjoy Star Wars with its light and dark side to the Force, or if you're a proponent of Manichaean dualism, you might be wondering if the dark triad is paired with the light triad. And in fact, it is. Recent research has uncovered a trio of 3 traits that are the inverse of the dark triad. I'm not going to even ask you to name the 3 elements of the light triad because I don't want you to risk your perfect record.
Okay.
The light triad is as follows. Kantianism, namely treating people as ends unto themselves, not merely as means to an end or objects to be manipulated. Humanism, valuing the dignity and worth of each individual, and faith in humanity, or believing in the fundamental goodness of human beings. The light triad is negatively related to the dark triad, but again, it's a continuum. There's a little bit of both dark and light in all of us. Researchers calculated a light versus dark triad balance for every study participant and found that the average balance was 1.3 in favor of the light side. So, assuming this was a representative sample, people are more good than bad. I took the study, a link to which you can find in the sources for this episode, and I was perfectly average. My score was slightly to the light side of the spectrum. I was very much on the light side with my unwillingness to manipulate and deceive others to get what I want, but if I want my light score to improve, I'll need to get better at trusting others.
Oh, I look forward to taking that. I'd like to think going into that test that I'm going to come closer to the light triad than the dark. But, I'm on faith in humanity. That's an interesting one. I'm not sure I have faith in humanity per se, but I have faith in the ability of humanity to figure it out, So the perfectibility of humanity is what I have faith in, not humanity per se, if that makes sense.
I think it makes a ton of sense in this age of COVID when we have people who, for political reasons, are insisting that a pandemic doesn't actually exist, even as it kills hundreds of thousands of people. Right. It is difficult, if you're plugged into certain news sources right now, to maintain a faith in the goodness of the average person.
Yeah.
So as a general rule, women are more likely to score higher than men on the light triad psychological traits, and men score higher on all three elements of the dark triad. But somewhat depressingly, the gap is closing, particularly in regard to narcissism, where women have become more of a match for men in recent studies. So, Joe, let's imagine you're voting in a Democratic presidential primary in which two candidates are still in the race. The first candidate is a young up-and-comer who has a reputation as a bold and charismatic leader out to change the world. He is confident and outspoken, and on the campaign trail, he's shown himself to be absolutely fearless. His opponents point out that he's flip-flopped on a number of issues, but he ignores that criticism and relentlessly pushes the issues he thinks will win him the election. The other candidate is an older, more experienced woman who frequently references her faith, regards her opponents as good people who happen to disagree on the issues, and has a track record of being a highly capable legislator who does not get as much credit as she deserves because she does not seek the spotlight. I have 3 questions for you. First, who are you likely to vote for? Second, who would you think has a better chance to win the general election? And third, who, if elected, would be the better president?
Yeah. Can I take the first question is by far the hardest one for me. Who would I vote for?
Mm-hmm.
Who's more likely to be a better president? I think the older, more experienced politician. Who's more likely to win? The younger, go-getter, ambitious go-getter. That's pretty clear to me. Who would I vote for? That's the toughie. And it's quite frankly, it's because the context matters, Who are they running against? The Hillary Clinton experience in 2016 was so shattering for so many liberals and progressives, Arguably the most qualified person to ever run for president loses to this charlatan. You have to believe there's some elements of dark triad versus light triad going on there, and I'm not sure I would vote for the older, experienced woman if I felt she couldn't beat the charlatan who she was up against in the election. And that's a sad commentary on me, but that's the God's honest truth.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. And one other thing that came to mind as I was contemplating this is there's so much, like in progressive circles, you hear people calling out for basically confrontational politics, and that's much more likely to come out of the dark triad than the light triad. Like we as progressives, maybe we should be careful what we wish for.
Yep.
But let's circle back to your question. And remember, possessing dark triad psychological traits doesn't mean you're inevitably going to be a sexual harasser, any more than being a psychopath means you're destined to be a serial killer. What you feel internally interacts with what you experience externally in very complicated ways, and the outcome of that interaction is impossible to predict. Human behavior is what emerges out of that complex and constantly shifting interaction. So, to answer your question, I'd say you were mostly right. There's definitely a direct and common link between politicians and sexual harassment, but the pursuit of power is, I'd say, more of an effect than a cause. Dark triad personality traits make you more likely to pursue power because you feel entitled to it, and because you feel like you're the only one who can get the job done. And in some ways, they make you more likely to succeed in that pursuit. Along the way, you'll manipulate other people and use them without guilt or remorse because your lack of empathy makes you impervious to how they feel about you or the things you do. In effect, both a political career and a history of sexual harassment are possible side effects of a single underlying condition. You can, of course, be a politician who doesn't harass his subordinates, and you can be a sexual harasser who has never run for office. But it's not at all surprising that we often see the two in combination.
Mm.
And the root of the problem isn't the dark triad, it's us. We as a society associate confidence with strength. And if you happen to be confident, charming, and strategically ruthless, people will write books about you, and future generations will study you for inspiration. The men you named at the top of this episode were in a position to harass subordinates because we keep electing that sort of person to office.
Yes.
The solution to that problem is for us all to start voting differently, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you really fleshed out my bare hypothesis and made sense of it for me. So thanks for that. I agree completely that we associate not just confidence, but also braggadocio we associate with strength, We associate arrogance and imperiousness with leadership. That's our mistake.
Sure.
That has nothing to do with the dark triad. That has to do with us.
Yeah.
So why the hell do we do that?
That's a question I've asked myself very many times over my life, since I'm someone who does not emanate confidence, but it's just a consistent.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's an American thing. I don't know if it'd be different in Japan or Bali or some other corner of the world, but it's a very consistent thing that, particularly if we're talking about men, if you're not confident and outspoken and aggressive, then you are judged to be weak.
Yeah. Now, the other takeaway I have from the interesting framing of the dark triad and the light triad is they seem not to be polar opposites. And that's fascinating to me, Like you need some of the qualities, some of the aspects of both in order to be a fully,
Sure.
I don't know what the word psychological term is, self-actualized human being. You need a little bit from the dark side and the light side, which again just underscores the genius of that Star Trek episode, because once good Kirk and bad Kirk can't survive independent of each other. And I think that's largely true.
Yeah, all roads do lead back to Star Trek. But of the dark triad, the psychopath is characterized by fearlessness and recklessness. And if you don't have some element of fearlessness and recklessness, you're not going to have any adventures. You're not going to try new things. And so,
Yes.
You have to be somewhere on that spectrum. You just don't want it to go so far that you start damaging other people's lives.
Yeah. You're also not going to have those war heroes who run into the machine gun nest and kill all the bad guys on the battlefield,
Right.
That's
Yeah.
a dark triad guy who did that, And God help us if we're led by those people, but God help us if we don't have any of them to eliminate the snipers.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Really interesting, Mark.
Well, I'm glad you like
I
it.
had a feeling that would be a fruitful question, and it was.
Yeah. Yeah. So are you ready for your question for next time?
I am, yeah. Lay it on me.
So this time my question concerns J.K. Rowling, who you might recognize as the author of the Harry Potter novels. Rowling is, of course, a great success story, and for years she was a hero in progressive political circles for using her Twitter feed, where she has nearly 14 million followers, to speak out in support of progressive causes. Lately, though, she has been outspoken on a different topic, her opposition to trans rights in the UK. Rowling has been called a TERF, or trans-exclusionary radical feminist. And my question is as follows. Where did the term TERF come from? And why are some feminists like Rowling so outspoken in opposition to legislation supporting rights for transsexuals?
Interesting. Boy, my wife is going to enjoy this question. I anticipate hours of conversation leading up to my presentation. But I'm also relieved because I thought you were going to ask me something about Harry Potter, and what I would have replied is, I know nothing about Harry Potter. Every time there's a Harry Potter clue on the New York Times crossword puzzle, I go to my son for those answers. So thankfully, this is not Harry Potter involved question. So
You can add as much or as little as Harry Potter as you want to your answer to my question.
okay, will do. All right, well, if you like this episode of Mansplaining, or you want to leave a comment about it, please go to our Facebook page. If you like what you heard about the dark triad and you want to try that for yourself, you can go to our Facebook page where Mark's sources for this episode will be posted. You can learn all about the dark triad and become a member of the dark side. How's that for a pitch?
Yeah, you can also take the test and find out just exactly how evil you might be.
Yes, that too. We welcome your feedback, positive or negative, and we welcome topic ideas for future episodes. All of that can be found at our Facebook page. Please go there if you're intrigued by this podcast. That's all for this edition of Mansplaining. That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you next time. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.